Gentrification, in the general sense, is used to describe the arrival of wealthier people in an existing urban district, a related increase in rents and property values, and changes in the district's character and culture. But isn't gentrification really just one result of a broader set of societal problems, like racism and income and educational inequality? Now, are there solutions that don't just try to stop change, and is gentrification all bad?
Well, one podcast is trying to ask the right questions about an issue that's not as politically potent as education, jobs, or safety, especially here in this city. It's WNYC Radio's There Goes the Neighborhood podcast, a powerful and unflinching exploration of gentrification in Brooklyn. And before we meet two members of the podcast team, let's meet Cynthia. Born and raised in Brooklyn and afraid that gentrification will change her once it hits her neighborhood of Canarsie. Take a look.
When I hear gentrification, I hear takeover. I hear disadvantage. If I had to blame gentrification on a specific group of people, it's hard to say because there really are a lot of factors in this whole issue. But I would say the people with the money, the people with the power, and that is the white upper class. Anybody who has the power and the ability to come into community and completely do whatever it is that they want with it, knowing that the people that do live in that community don't have that same power, it is a complete unmatched fight. So the white upper class, I would definitely say, has more responsibility here than they like to admit.
Here with us to tell us more about There Goes the Neighborhood is WNYC producer Rebecca Carroll, who specializes in special projects about race. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
And let's welcome back D.W. Gibson, a freelance journalist who's been covering gentrification in New York City unlike any other reporter, and it is so good to have you both here today.
Thanks for having us.
Great to be here.
Now, the word gentrification, it means so many things to so many different people. What would you say are the general stakeholders, and what are their attitudes toward just the mere mention of the word gentrification?
I'm going to actually volley that to DW because he can speak directly to the stakeholders, but I do want to also address the idea, this notion of gentrification as a term and as a word. And part of the reason that it's so hard to define is by design, right? I mean, it's sort of a generic term that has some very, very pointed aspects to it, very sharp aspects to it, racism, inequality, and the rest. But I would argue that that is by design. People use it's a nice word, gentrification.
Is it?
Well, I mean, it sounds nice.
Sounds pretty.
You know, it sounds pretty, right? In some ways. But in fact, there are all of these things bubbling underneath that are actually at the heart of this country.
Okay. DW?
Yeah, I mean, I think gentrification is more like a bucket with a whole bunch of ideas in it. It starts with this notion of land and who owns the land. But I think it's often a conversation stopper because it riles a lot of animosity and emotion. I think it's very good for us to get more specific about what we're talking about. Are we talking about money coming into a neighborhood? Are we talking about people being pushed out of a neighborhood? Are we talking about architecture and the aesthetics of the street as we walk down them? There are a lot of components that come into play, and I think it's good to be more precise as we talk about these things.
So we usually have our A segment start off with some slides and we sort of set the context, but this wasn't one of those days where we needed slides to tell people in Brooklyn what gentrification is. And we had a town hall meeting here that we packed the place to talk about gentrification, but I wonder what your approach is. How do you get your arms around this from a different standpoint, especially using a medium like podcasts?
I mean, I think for me, certainly approaching it with a lens through race and racial inequality and racial justice, it was really, really important to elevate the voices that are, of course, not heard. And that's a phrase we throw around a lot. But in this case, gentrification is, of course, a machine. And there are all sorts of monetary and economic and policy issues. But what doesn't happen is that we hear from the people who are so impacted. You know, I think I read somewhere a report where somebody said, it was I think a white journalist who said, you know, nobody looks at these neighborhoods that are poor and where there's crime and this and that and thinks that's a great neighborhood. But in fact, there are people who live here who, despite not, being low income or dealing with crime or whatever there is, have made lives and who count on each other and who have families and who have created community. And that is really, I think, comes into sharp relief with our episode 2, where this young man, Joshua Jacobo, who lives in East New York, talks about how, when people wanted to give up on this neighborhood, we stayed here and we made a community. And now everybody wants that. Right. And that's ours. We made that. And unfortunately, he doesn't have the power to keep it.
Okay. Now, you mentioned that clip. We actually have that here, so let's have a listen.
When everybody gave up on the neighborhood, we didn't. We stood in the neighborhood. We worked it out, and we made it the better place that everybody wants to invest into now.
East New York, that's where we're going this week. Last week on There Goes the Neighborhood, we were in Bed-Stuy.
Well, back in the days, it was everybody. We had all my aunt, my mother, sisters, everybody lived in Bed-Stuy. It has changed. Like all these buildings here, people lived in these. I said, did you close on it yet? If you ain't closed on it, we don't have no conversation. He said, well, I came to offer you some money. Because I said, you are out of your mind. You have fell and bumped your head. He said, I will have you evicted, and you out on the street, and you won't get nothing. He called Con Ed and said, you can cut the electricity off. I refuse to be moved out of my place, or where I feel comfortable, where I live.
So these are real people with real issues. What was the benefit of using a podcast as a platform?
Well, I mean, I think it allows us to get around the city and get into the places where the action is. I mean, we did a few interviews at the outset with sort of so-called experts, and a couple of them were from academia. And I actually went back and listened to one of the interviews recently to see if we could fit it into an upcoming episode, and it felt wrong. I think Rebecca is really sort of hitting at the heart of what we're trying to do with this. It's get on the street and see what it feels like, how this sort of abstract idea of gentrification plays out in daily lives. That's what we're really chasing. So grab a microphone and get out into the city, and we're in churches, we're on the street, we're in homes, we're in schools, we're everywhere.
I mean, Rebecca, I'm sorry, you spoke a moment ago about people like residents who are in East New York who say, okay, we made this good, when someone else said, but who wants to move there? But there is a very specific set of people who do look at it as a potential place where they can create the next neighborhood or whatever it is that they design. And the city council is going to vote tomorrow on this whole East New York rezoning plan. So I wonder from you guys what you hope the political impact of this will be.
Well, I hope the political impact is that and I want to just go back and add on to what DW said about podcast as the medium for this, which is that you really can't deny the voices when you hear them. So as opposed to print or online or whatever reportage where, we're telling you, journalists are telling you how to feel about these folks. I mean, you can quote people, but when you actually hear from people, it's very hard to deny, and I think that that's what we need right now on this issue, particularly as we await and come up against the mayor's ruling, but also that this notion that it's an abstract idea. I think it's abstract only to people who are not immediately impacted. Again, I live in Williamsburg on the other side. That is about as far from, Bedford Avenue and that whole kind of branding of Williamsburg, which is primarily Black and Latino. And I was at the church yesterday. There, that's right across from the only housing project in Williamsburg. And there's this sense that we're all right, we're okay, because we still have each other. They have no idea what's about to happen. But the wheels are turning, and there's already plans, to be sure. So, I mean, I think that that the voices kind of counteract this kind of abstract notion.
I want to talk about the evolution of the project and those voices, because it seems like it was something where the circles got larger and larger, where it may have started in WNYC or the offices there with people sitting around a table like we do, and then you guys sort of marched out and pushed it. So how did you include these voices and call on folks to be included in the podcast?
So we should mention that this is a partnership with The Nation magazine. Mm-hmm. Kai Wright, who's the features editor there, is the host of the podcast, and he had been talking with WNYC producers, and obviously people. This is in the air. This is in the zeitgeist, gentrification, and so it started. Brewing as a podcast idea. I came on again in the fall to work on a series of special projects on race. And so when I came onto the project, I was sort of like, look, we need to really look at the racial, repercussions of gentrification, because people sort of talk about it, but they don't actually hit it hard. And I think that now is the time to do that, when we are in a moment of great momentum surrounding Black voices, Black culture, Black racial justice. So we just, like any project, and this is my first podcast, but it's just going over and over ideas and drafts and trying things out. Initially, Kai and I were going to try to host it together, because what makes a lot of podcasts work is this kind of talky thing. Yeah. But then we realized we really wanted it to sound like the city. And so that meant going out there and giving people agency to tell the story themselves.
Okay. I have to ask you, DW, as a journalist, what is so enthralling and captivating about just the subject of gentrification as it plays out in New York to you that makes you want to just focus on it in the way you do?
Because it goes to the most fundamental necessities of life: shelter and employment, and all of the things that spring from that. And we're a big team. I mean, a lot of people are working on this podcast, so it takes a lot of people to fan out and to find people to talk to, because we talk to a lot of people, and that's just a lot of invested hours, because we establish relationships with people. We're rarely talking to someone for 10 or 15 minutes. We're often talking to them for an hour or so, trying to really, really capture something about their lives. And to the point about the policy, too, I want to underscore that the vote taken up tomorrow is about the mandatory inclusion plan that the mayor's put together. It's actually not about the East New York zoning plan. That's going to be voted on in the next 40 days or so. And I highlight that difference because there's still time for people to sort of let their voices be heard. The mandatory inclusion plan simply talks to the range of people that would be included in what is affordable housing, right? The range of incomes that are eligible. But what's really important to my mind in East New York and in other neighborhoods we're going to go into is looking at not what's the average income in New York City, but what's the average income in East New York? What are the people who live there right now, what are they making? Because I want to make sure we have enough units, quantity of units, to meet the needs of the people that are already there.
So what can we expect in the next 6 episodes? We've got the last 45 seconds are yours to tell us a little curtain raiser.
Do you want to take that?
Wow. I mean, we're gonna go deeper into East New York. We're gonna learn more about the zoning plan, bring it to life.
We're gonna talk about inclusion and exclusion in a post-gentrified neighborhood. Who are these neighborhoods for? What does it feel like once they're gentrified? Who are the amenities for? What is the aesthetic? How is it recycled?
And we're going to talk about scams and fraudsters and people sort of taking advantage of these situations.
What most surprised you? Do you have like a little anecdote or something that you thought you knew, but then you were surprised by?
People are going to have to tune in. Once again, where can they listen in for the podcast?
We're on iTunes, and
you are on iTunes.
Yes, and also on our page www.WNYC.org/neighborhood.
All right, thank you. We'll be listening.
All right,
Thanks, you
great.
guys.
And watching here. It's a happy marriage.